Okay, so we kind of left off with the example of this horse as being a closed form, and in contrast, this piece is considered an open form because it actually is open. His arms are open, and he's interacting. His shape is actually interacting with the space around it. It's not just closed off. So just remember in sculpture, closed and open, what that means. So this is by Alberto Giacometti. It's Man Pointing from 1947. It's made out of bronze. And just kind of take a little time and ask yourself what you think this sculpture might mean. What do you think this sculpture symbolizes? And then maybe how has the artist used the medium to back up the meaning of the artwork? So the slight mass of this piece, Man Pointing, conveys a sense of fleeting presence. The tall, thin figure appears eroded by time and barely existing. So he's used that rough metal surface and eroded it down to make the meaning of a man that's barely existing. So he's using the medium to back up the content of his piece, which is the meaning, which is a man that barely exists. And the man is pointing, he has his arm out, which makes it an open form. So the figure reaches out, its arms are spread wide, the face seems to peer into the distance, and the feet are also pointed outward. The open form in this work interacts with the surrounding space. It is thought to symbolize the fleeting presence of man. So the artist has been able to get that content across with his medium and how he's presented it. The thinness of the man really shows that he is barely existing. The fact that he's eroding, the metal is rough, the texture is rough, it looks like it's eroding away, is a very successful use of medium and form to back up the content or the meaning of the piece, which is the very delicate nature and the fleeting presence of man. So the next element of art that we'll cover quickly is space. Space is the general receptacle of all things. How space is organized in a work of art is a very important consideration. Of all the visual elements, space is the most difficult to convey in words and pictures. To experience a three-dimensional space, we must be in it. Architects are especially concerned with the qualities of space. Imagine how you feel in a room with a low ceiling. And then what if you were in a room with a 50-foot ceiling? What if you added skylights? Your experience of that room would change dramatically, right? So this piece by Doug Wheeler, I'm not going to go through the actual title of the piece. He just kind of made a random thing of numbers here. It's from 1975 to 2012. It's reinforced fiberglass with LED lights and high intensity fluorescent lights, UV fluorescence. So a bunch of different kinds of lights are used, and an architecturally modified space. So it's a fairly large space, 564 inches by 702 inches. And this is an installation piece. So an installation piece is one that you can actually it has to be installed into a room, and it's more of like you walk into it. So with this installation, Doug Wheeler creates a feeling of infinite space. Viewers who enter the space are confronted with a space that appears to be divided in two by a wall of light. Closer approach through the diffused membrane slowly reveals a room that seems to be of infinite dimensions. The artist referred to this work as a continuous atmospheric environment. So it's kind of interesting. You have to go in here and walk around. I think you even have to put little booties on so you don't make the floor dirty. So space in 2 dimensions. So we've talked about 3-dimensional space, but we haven't talked about 2-dimensional space yet. With two-dimensional space, we have the picture plane to look at. So the picture plane is actually that flat surface that you put your picture on. Either you paint or draw it or etch it or whatever. It's flat. We see the space of the surface and the surface of the picture plane all at one time. So with drawings, prints, photos, painting, each space, surface, or picture plane is defined by the edges of the piece. Within the boundary of the picture plane, there are a variety of ways artists can create depth in the picture plane. So that's one of the things that artists really have to deal with, is that they have a flat surface that they're trying to make into a three-dimensional surface. So say they're trying to draw a landscape, how do they make it look three-dimensional, even though they're doing it on a 2D space? So that's kind of tricky for artists. So this is a really old piece. It's called Pool in the Garden. It's a wall painting from the tomb of Nibanum in Egypt. It's from 1400 BCE, paint on dry plaster. So notice how it shows little depth. Ancient artists didn't really know how to create realistic depth in their paintings. And so Egyptian painters usually always showed objects from their most easily recognizable angle. So the pool is actually pictured from above, while all the animals are actually pictured from the side, because they thought that that was the most recognizable view of the animal and the pool, and even the trees are from the side. And this person has a profile view as well. At least the face is in profile. So they don't really have it worked out at this stage. Artists don't at this stage in ancient Egypt on how to create a three-dimensional space on a 2D surface. Implied depth. Almost any mark on a picture plane begins to give the illusion of a third dimension, depth. Illustrated in the diagram are a few ways artists can indicate space on a flat picture plane. So we'll talk about those. So this is how artists create depth in a flat picture plane. So figure A shows overlap. So if you overlap things, that helps to create depth. The object that overlaps another object appears closer to us. So this one appears the closest, the next closest, and then this one is the furthest away, just from a simple overlap. Another way of doing it is overlap with diminishing size added in there. So objects that get smaller appear further away. And then they're also overlapping. So figure C shows overlap, diminishing size, and vertical placement. So vertical placement, objects lower down on the picture plane seem closer to us, and objects higher in the picture plane seem farther away. So this one seems like it's the closest to us, the next closest, and then that's the furthest away. Figure D shows all of them together, overlap, diminishing size, vertical placement, and diminishing size, all put together. And that really helps to create a three-dimensional space on a 2D surface. And these are little tricks that artists use to create depth. So here's Paul Cezanne, Still Life with Apples, 1890, oil on canvas, 13 inches roughly by 18 inches. Paul Cezanne suggested depth in various ways in his small work, Still Life with Apples. We see the horizon line of the tabletop at either end of the picture. He overlapped the fruit to create depth. The lemon is closer to us and lower in the picture as well. So it overlaps these two apples, and it's lower down on the picture plane, and it's overlapping. So that's creating an illusion of this being closer to us. And the same with some of these apples. These two apples appear closer to us than these two apples because they're overlapping. Okay, I had to pause the video there for a minute, but so we're going to move on to linear perspective. So this is a kind of a technique used in the visual arts, and it's a means of representing three-dimensional objects in space on a two-dimensional surface. And it was actually perfected during the 15th century in Italy, so in the 1400s. And in the West, we've really become accustomed to artists using linear perspective, also called perspective, And it's based on the way we see things, and it really helps us to depict objects in a space on a 2D space in a really realistic way. So it's a little trick that artists use to create a very realistic piece. So here's a diagram that shows linear perspective. And so figure A shows that parallel lines converge at a singular point as they move off into the distance. And this is called the vanishing point. So if you were to take a picture, you would see this. The road would get smaller and smaller and smaller. Any kind of fence would get smaller and smaller and smaller. The tree line would get smaller and smaller and smaller and go all into one singular point, which is called, like I said, the vanishing point. The horizon line is at the eye level of the artist's eye. In a finished picture, the artist's eye level becomes the eye level of anyone looking at the picture, although the actual horizon is oftentimes frequently blocked from view. So the actual horizon is where the sky meets the earth. And sometimes that can be blocked by trees and stuff, so you might not actually see the actual horizon. But in a picture, the horizon line is the eye level of the artist. Using linear perspective, this system can take a picture, and the picture can be constructed from a single fixed position called a vantage point. So the artist who paints landscape should not move around and should paint from the same place to get a realistic picture in the end. So they have to keep their vantage point the same. Sorry, I had to pause the video there. So this is a 1-point linear perspective as well in figure B, but it's showing cubes at eye level, above eye level, and below eye level. So here's eye level, below, so you see the top, you see the sides at eye level, and then you see the bottom and the side at above eye level. 2-point linear perspective actually has 2 vanishing points, and I think it's really going to help to watch the video that I am putting in the content area of week 1 to understand linear perspective, because it's a little bit more complicated and it's kind of hard to understand very well. So watching that video is really going to help. So Raphael, he is a famous Renaissance artist. This is from 1508. It's a fresco painting, so it was painted on a wall of plaster. It's called the School of Athens. And it placed the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle against an architectural space. Raphael used perspective for emphasis. We can gather that Plato and Aristotle are the most important figures in this painting because of their placement on the vanishing point. So he actually used the vanishing point to draw our eyes into these 2 figures who are the most important 2 figures in the piece. So all lines in the architecture lead to them. If we're to remove the figures from the background, Plato and Aristotle become hard to spot. So those lines in the background, if we remove those, it's hard to see Plato and Aristotle. So those architectural lines really do help lead our eye into the most important piece, the most important people in the painting, which is Plato and Aristotle. So you can see, some of these lines here in the architecture are starting to go back into that one point, which is called the vanishing point. And a lot of the other lines, even these lines, are all going back into, and they all lead to these 2 figures. So the artist really did use linear perspective here to craft this piece and really lead your eye into the most important focal point in the piece. So we can see here's the perspective lines I was talking about going in. These lines from the tiles, the lines from some of these architectural pieces up here, all going down into the center. And then if you take the figures out of the architectural space, like Aristotle and Plato don't even stick out at all. So they really do need those lines in the piece to lead your eye to them.